Hi, and welcome to the Voice of Bold Business Radio. I am your host, Jess Dewell of Red Direction. Today, we're talking outsourcing, which is interesting because some of us think delegation is outsourcing, and it is so much different than that. Whether we're hiring an outside contractor to do a task or provide a service on an ongoing basis, there are things that must be considered. So this is the business of outsourcing. And there's a lot of places that a contract and a relationship around a project or a service that is outsourced can break down. That failure, we can either bang our heads against the wall and keep trying and do nothing different, or we can take a step back and go, well, we know we need to save money. We know we need to innovate. We know we need to do something more for a little while. And then things will be at the capacity with the resources that we have. Whatever situation we're finding ourselves in, we must know why we want to outsource in the first place. And here to talk to me and with me today is Alex Danzberger. He is going to answer the question, what are the most common and overlooked steps when deciding to outsource? Let me tell you a little bit about Alex. Alex Danzberger is an adaptable, strategic thought leader who establishes new avenues for growth and improves delivery capabilities. He rapidly evaluates enterprise competencies and strategies against the competitive environment to create and execute effective action plans. Alex also brings a multinational experience across several industries that successfully build collaborative and cross-cultural teams. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the Voice of Bold Business, the show that provides everything smart leaders need to evaluate situations, build relationships, and create solutions. Jessica Dewell candidly talks about the skills necessary to build tenacity and do more with less. And now, here's Jessica.
Okay, Alex, I want to know, what are the most common overlooked steps when somebody, company, program, division decides to outsource something that they're doing?
Great. Good question, Jess. So just to give you some background in my experience with outsourcing, I've done kind of two different things. One, I lived overseas and I ran the Asia Pacific Shared Services Group for a large multinational, which was essentially an internal outsourcing platform for a multinational corporation in Asia Pacific. And my job was to provide services to business units across the entire region as essentially a third-party processor. And then as a technology executive, I've worked in several companies that have outsourced projects. And so I kind of come at it from both perspectives, which is outsourcing is usually about a business process being outsourced to a service provider or a discrete project being outsourced to a partner. There are a lot of benefits that come from outsourcing. Principally, it's access to resources, scarce resources that you may not have in your organization. It gives you more operating flexibility in terms of accessing resources during periods of peak demand. It gives you potentially, oftentimes it's talked about in terms of getting to a low cost or lower cost solution. It can be a real asset in terms of helping to accelerate time to market for a product or completion of a project. So there are a lot of benefits that can be derived from outsourcing. That being said, to your question, to the point of this, which is there are a lot of potential pitfalls that come from outsourcing. First and foremost, outsourcing is a contractual relationship between you and the outsourced provider. And so on both sides of the equation, that contract becomes the basis for the business. If the contract isn't detailed and fully complete, a bad business process done by a third party is even worse. So you want to be really careful about making sure that everything is highly detailed in terms of the roles and responsibilities. And also, because it is a contractual relationship, that the outsourced provider will only work within the strict definitions of that contract. So they don't really think outside the box. They don't really consider what more needs to be done. They do what they're told to do, and that's part of their economics, whereas an employee would think beyond that. You also need to have, when you consider doing, again, given the nature of the type of relationship, a service level agreement. So within that contract, in terms of understanding what your expectations are, being able to communicate that clearly to your outsourced partner. One of the things that most people probably don't necessarily consider is that outsourcing can create internal frustration for employees, because you can have a situation where the more interesting work, the more cutting edge work is outsourced to a third party, and the employees are left doing the day-to-day things that need to get done, but they're excluded from development and innovation. And that I've seen several times. It can really become somewhat counterproductive and can lead to an outsourced project potentially failing when it comes back into the work environment because it wasn't invented there, if you will. And the other thing that we often, is kind of commonplace is in terms of communication, but also cultural understanding, that there are just fundamental differences when you're working with people from around the world. Cultural style, the communication style, the work ethic, time zones, all those different kinds of factors, kind of the human side of it, are things that need to be carefully considered.
It's interesting because when you put people into a contractual arrangement, though they create boundaries. And you had said one of the biggest pitfalls is not having those clear boundaries defined. I'd like to go into a little bit more depth there because people are like, well, even in organizations do this. It doesn't matter if you're a person in the organization that says, let's outsource this project, or you're tasked with the strategic development of something and outsourcing is a requirement based off of all the benefits that you were sharing. When those boundaries aren't clear, we have a big problem. And people forget that that's a big thing to define. They're like, oh, well, we'll just outsource that. That becomes somebody else's problem. So what are things that you have found in your experiences that you wish you had known when you first started doing outsourced projects, or starting this, even being part of the conversation with, as part of the multinational company, helping people choose your service?
Managing expectations is the critical thing. I mean, the good news is, as I've gotten into it, I'm not necessarily traveling new ground. So a lot of this is our business practices, if you will, best practices that are known, but it's managing expectations and determining how success is going to be measured and what metrics are important. And dependent upon the type of work being done, if you're outsourcing a business process, for example, having good, accurate metrics before you do the outsource so that everybody understands how the process is behaving, if you will, in the current environment, and so that you can get an accurate measure once it is outsourced, is important. And it's, in that respect, it's no different than having a full and complete product specification before you outsource it. To turn over a complex project to an organization halfway around the world and say, figure it out. Companies should have the internal processes to go through that disciplined review before they outsource it, even on an internal basis. And it requires a lot of self-awareness for companies, for individuals, to realize how much work gets done on an informal basis versus in an outsourced environment where you can't rely on the informal as much anymore. It has to be on a more structured basis because, again, the outsourcer, their business model is to charge you for resources utilized. And from their perspective, your interests aren't really aligned, because the more resources they use, the more money they make, versus for you, the more resources they use, the more expensive the process is. So in that sense, the two aren't necessarily well aligned.
I can see that being a recipe for disaster, not having and it's funny because you're like, yeah, all these best practices are out there. However, I'm wondering, all those things that we outsource every single day as an organization, do we really take a look and go, well, what's their motivation and what's our motivation? And where's that gap? Because it's easy to assume somebody who's outsourcing, we're outsourcing to, just is in our head. And we're just like, oh, well, they're doing this task. But in reality, unless we understand, what I heard you say was that unless we understand why we're doing it and the reasons and what we're measuring to, we don't even know if that's smart money. Right.
That's very, very true. And I think a lot before making a decision to outsource, there needs to be a lot of, if you will, kind of soul-searching internal analysis and review in terms of what is our goal in doing this. If it's, for example, if it's purely to save money, again, a business process is resource intensive. And so you want to make sure that you have your business process well-defined and optimized before you outsource it to somebody else, because once they have it, they really have no interest in trying to improve it. Right. So again, their business model is kind of counterproductive to the goals of the host company that's looking for the outsourced service.
when we don't know our internal goals. And one of the
Right.
things that you said is once the outsourcing occurs, there will be, unless the contract is around innovation, there will be zero in innovation.
Potentially, yes. There should be, because the business process requires upon consistency and reliability. And so
Right.
you've asked them to deliver a certain end goal and to do it in a certain way. And they've costed the delivery of that service based upon them doing things a certain way. You want them to do it on the most cost-effective basis. You have to give them the most efficient process in order to do that.
So let's look at the side of the outsourcer, because the person providing the service. So they may or may not decide where their positioning is in the marketplace and how much innovation they need. So
Right.
by a company choosing an outsourced partner and not understanding how they view themselves in their own market, we could be setting ourselves back. Does that make sense?
There are plenty of outsourced companies and very sophisticated companies that are out there that their business model is to help companies do process reengineering and do all those kinds of things. And again, there are two different types of outsourcing. There's project-based and there's services. So on the services side, you look at some of the major companies that are out there. Simple example, Amazon World Services, AWS, and Amazon Cloud. You want to run it, you want to self-host, you can self-host. If you don't want to host, then you can go to AWS, or you can go to Microsoft Azure, or whatever the case may be. But that's an outsource. It's an outsourced service. And so you sign an agreement with them, and they deliver a certain quantity of computing capacity for what you're paying. But when you do that, they do certain things and you do certain things. And from their perspective, they're only responsible to give you what you've signed up for and nothing more than that. And their whole business model is around automation of a platform and making it highly scalable and cost efficient. If you're running an organization whose technology is more volatile, where you're trying to do something that's more innovative, it may be more worth your while to actually do it yourself for a period of time, which may be more expensive, until you get to the point that it's much more standard and stabilized, that you can go to someone like one of the public cloud companies to outsource it for you, as a simple example. Typically, you're not going to ask an outsource provider to do something that you don't already understand needs to be done. You just may not have the resources to do it, or they may be able to do it in a more cost-effective way. Risk, however, is when you outsource so much of it, then you don't have the internal resources that are conversant in what's being done, perhaps as much. And so you potentially lose an edge, depending upon what it is that's being outsourced, but you potentially lose that practical knowledge and application of it for your own organization.
It's almost like part of that planning then has to include some sort of an exit plan. How do we know when this doesn't work for us anymore?
Well, it requires careful project management with any kind of an outsource, particularly on discrete projects. So once you develop your app for the iPhone, you don't need the same level of resources you need to maintain it. And those are very specialized resources in terms of designing apps. And so for a product company, particularly an early stage company, you may turn to an outsource provider to build something for you, which is more cost effective in the long run than hiring on a staff and maintaining that staff and the payroll, because it's a discrete need. If you're trying to get to the teach a man to fish kind of analogy, which is I think what you're trying to get to, if you don't understand what you're outsourcing, if you don't understand your ask, it's a recipe for disaster. A friend of mine, a company I'm working with right now, had an experience where they outsourced the development of their platform to a group in India. And the entrepreneur that started the company has good technology skills, but didn't really know himself how to adequately evaluate the work that was being done. And in this case, it was a very unscrupulous provider who was basically showing them slideware online based upon a defined set of parameters as opposed to a fully functioning software platform. And it ended up going to court, and my friend won the case, but by a long shot. But it was one of those situations where In retrospect, he needed more technology resources available to work directly with the project manager and work directly with the outsource partner in terms of making sure that the work that they were saying they were doing was what was actually being done.
There are organizations that are just like, well, I just don't want to do that. Well, when we just say that's out of our area of expertise, but we need to do it anyway. When they get into that realm, I totally see how that could be a recipe for disaster. And your story, wow, it really happens. And it takes time and it takes more money to be able to go to court and to get all of that settled.
Yeah,
and
he lost a year.
Yeah, a year.
In the evolution of a startup, a year is a lot of time.
It is. It's an incredible amount of time. And then, of course, all the resources are tied up in that. So it's not like you can have a parallel track during that time.
No, yeah, exactly.
This concept of project management, we're going to take a detour here because there are organizations that hire project managers. There are organizations that have loads of developers, all these people that are able to be around. In a smaller organization, when you've got 100 people or less, there's going to be more hats spread across less people. In the case of your friend, hindsight being 2020, let's pretend we could have a magic wand and do it all over again with the knowledge of Alex. And would you have said to him, hey, you know what? Hire a CTO by the hour, somebody that does just that to help you understand what you're asking and what to check for along the way? Would it have been, you really need to hire a project manager and this is what they're looking for and it's their job to do it? What would you have suggested, hindsight being 2020, as one of the potential options?
Right. It would have made sense to have a stronger technical partner involved to evaluate the work that was being done. With a lot of offshore outsourcing, one of the models that is proven successful and is popular is when the offshore outsource partner has an onshore project management leader. It helps a great deal in terms of being part of the sponsor's team and having the benefit of face-to-face communication and kind of being able to translate between the organizations helps tremendously. The outsourcing organization, I think, needs to have the resources to be able to evaluate the work that's being done.
So planning and evaluation in an ongoing form are two really key pieces. And where does that start? Does that get driven from the bottom up? Does that get driven from the top down?
Usually outsourcing is a tops-down directive, but I think the real planning is a bottoms-up process. It's the people that, kind of, if you will, at the coal seam that really know what's happening and know the details of it, then have to be involved in the process. And any organization would be wise to get their buy-in to what's being done and why. And so a lot of, it shouldn't be a knee-jerk decision, hey, let's outsource, next week. It needs to have a lot of work that goes into a lot of forethought and planning. Again, going back to goals and metrics and SLAs in terms of expectations, roles and responsibilities and expectations on both organizations.
Instant gratification, tangent of instant gratification. Companies want it as much as we do as people. And when you have an organization made up of a whole bunch of people that are used to just pressing buttons and getting what they want, picking up the phone and having all of this stuff, it's hard to switch. So how do you personally hold that paradox of, I got to take a lot of time to really be strategic and ask the right questions and make sure I've got the buy-in from my team. And so everybody on the other end is having instant gratification. And once I choose my outsource partner, then I get to have it too.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So it's the process needs to be like any process that is, kind of has a longer term duration. I think it's important. Whoever is the project lead needs to manage up in terms of setting the expectations of what the process needs to look like and the consequences if the process isn't followed properly or well. You don't want to get 90 days into a project and realize you've just flushed $100,000 or whatever the number is.
Sure.
So it's kind of, we're going to take our time and here's why. And here's the critical path, the milestones along the way that we need to hit. And here are it's basic project management. Here are the resources that I need to get there, so that the gratification is hitting those milestones. So you get that feedback along the way towards the goal of a complete specification, a complete outline of roles and responsibilities, a complete outline of measurements of success and resources required and everything else, so that you've got a very, a good package, which you need to have if you're going to outsource. You're going to want to take it to multiple potential providers. And so the more tight your specifications and all that documentation is, the better you're going to be able to negotiate with your outsourced partner, whoever that you may end up choosing.
And when we're thinking about this instant gratification, from the things that you said, taking time, knowing, having a deadline, having a plan, being on the path, yet not feeling rushed, as long as we're on the path. When we get off the path, I could get some of that. Now we're talking about, like, when we go back to the part of the conversation where, they want to bill for resources used and you want a different thing. And I say they outsource, you, the company. So not you and me, but in those capacities. This is another point then for a miscommunication to occur, because if an outsourced partner that you're actually talking to, seeing if it would be good to work together, if they're chomping at the bit and they want this yesterday, may not be a good partner, because they're looking for their instant gratification, which means they might not be thinking about all the things that need to be thought about.
Right. Well, it's like anything else, you check references.
Yeah.
Right. So, and outsourcing, we're making a big thing of it here in terms of technology and services. The reality is, if you hire a contractor to put in a sink, you've outsourced sink installation.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't have the capability to do it. So, we outsource as individuals every day in one way, shape, form, or another.
Click Amazon Prime. Click Amazon Prime. Click Netflix.
Right. And so when you think about, again, outsourcing a major software development project or outsourcing a business service, think about your own personal experiences in terms of when you've outsourced something to somebody else to have it done and when you haven't been satisfied with the outcome. Mm-hmm. And think about why you haven't been. And usually it's around expectations and managing expectations and having clarity. And, contractors, they'll do a change order. You said you wanted, these 3 light fixtures, and what you really wanted was 5, but you assumed that the contractor knew you wanted 5. And so they bid for 3, and all of a sudden, they're going to charge you another couple $100 to put in the other 2. Mm-hmm. I've done, unfortunately, a couple of house renovations, and I could write a book. On each one. Yeah. And you think you learned it all the first time, and I learned a lot, but still had issues the second time. There's always something that comes up that you just kind of assume the way you might choose to do something is the way others will choose to do it too. And it's not always the case. And you need to vocalize what you need, what those expectations are, and ensuring you get to the outcome that you want.
Mm-hmm. How much feeling goes into this process? We're talking a lot about analytics. We're talking about a lot of keeping track of things and data.
Right.
When something doesn't feel right and you're in the middle of it, how do you deal with those feelings? Those kind.
I think intuition is important in anything in terms of just the dynamic of kind of, sensing that something's not quite right here. When you start to, put together a series of facts, but it's got to be fact-based.
Always.
But
always. The feeling has a place to go, okay, what factor are we missing? What do we need to look into more?
Right. Yes. Yeah. On the front end, in terms of getting recommendations, and when, as you're checking those recommendations and the facts don't seem quite right, or if you're, if it just feels like they're trying to lead you down a particular path to evaluate their recommendations and you're not really getting a chance to really check the market the way that you think you should. Mm-hmm. Whatever the case may be, we all, our spidey senses all get triggered by different things, but it really needs to be fact-based, again, which goes into the initial work up front in terms of establishing the metrics, the measurement for success. And that's the basis for the contract.
Yeah. And by the way, the basis for business, and by the way, the reason it can be sustainable and that we can have employees and we can contribute in our own local communities. Right. Because if we weren't doing that and we're totally flying by the seat of our pants all the time,
right?
There's a lot
of
that's a whole different kind of culture we're talking about. By the way, I know some companies like that.
Right.
So, and they don't, and it's really interesting because if we're going from that place of feeling first,
Right.
that concept of metrics is more important. If we're starting from metrics, what really looks good on paper and what really sounds good. I mean, now I'm thinking about the car that I own right now. It
Right.
looked really good on paper. It's great. And I really don't like driving it.
Right.
But that's the feeling piece. Everything else, it looked great on paper. So there's a
Right.
place for it. And
Right.
whichever way you start, I mean, I start from
Right.
an emotional place, feeling,
Right.
oh,
Right.
I like this person. Oh, I
Right.
like this idea. Oh, okay,
Right.
I can totally see this. But
Right.
then I go back to the drawing board. How does all that fit into this? And does it actually make sense for this project at this time to get what we want done?
Right. Totally true. I mean, it's in that sense, it's no different than dating.
It's true.
Particularly in an online dating world. I mean, it's just, you're judging the book by the cover.
Yeah.
You don't know what's good or bad, right or wrong, whatever at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
You're going on your intuition, but then you got to meet the person. And that's where that feeling comes into it of, this isn't quite what I expected.
Right. It's a different kind of the rubber meets the road piece
Right.
there.
Right.
And, okay, I like that you brought up the dating thing because it's true. It's true. Well, and the reason I bring it, the reason I really like it is because the more connected we are and the more things we do online, people have this perception of us and it's either really fake or really real. There's no in between anymore.
Right.
And companies can get presentation is everything. And somebody who can sell great may not have a great service. Somebody who has the best intentions may have no project management experience and not get you where you want to go on time.
Right.
And so all of those checks and balances are really important to bring it all home and have long relationships.
Yeah. All those data points will feed your feeling and intuition about whether this is the right person to work with and whether they're doing the right thing that you think needs to be done.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
And thinking about from being an outsourced provider,
right?
I need to really understand the people that I'm serving and that every relationship ends, kind of like a dating, right? Every relationship ends. Sometimes it's death to us part. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's walking out on the first date. We got the whole spectrum.
Right.
Sometimes it's seeing in the restaurant and walking right back out the door. You didn't even make the connection.
What you're saying is trust matters.
Yes, it does.
I think so. Yes. If you're looking at some other perspective, if you are an outsourced service provider, whether it's product development or continuous service, if you want your business to thrive, you need to connect with your prospects and engender trust. And the way to do that, I believe, is to really walk in their shoes in terms of understanding that they're about to become reliable on you for a critical part of their business. And so if they're going to be reliable on you, they want to know that you are reliable. And that's the trust factor. So how do you do that? It's really through, I think it's really through really focusing on what matters and the metrics and measurability and accountability. That's critical, would be critical to your success as an outsourced solution provider.
Yes, and yes, and yes. And to add to that then comes this concept of we need to know the space in which our service fits best the people we are serving. Mm-hmm. And if they're not there yet, here's what you've got to do for me to be a good solution provider for you.
Right.
And then at the other end too, this is where we stop. We cannot guarantee what we do anymore will work for you. And recognize and have hard conversations. Hey, you guys are at this upper limit. We love working with you. Here's what it's going to look like. And then it's almost starting all over again with that contract phase of you guys are growing out of what we want. We love working with you. This is great. This has lasted a really long time. So now what?
Right.
Do we need to be honest with each other? This just isn't a match anymore and we must walk away.
Right.
And I would be glad to tell you where to go, says the outsourced company to their client. And I think, that goes back to the not only trust, but the credibility piece and this is the longevity of relationships that somebody can have.
Right. No, I mean, I've seen situations of outsourced solution providers that forget that they're really in a partnership and that partnership requires both sides being candid and truthful with each other. You've got to, you need to deliver for your shareholders, for your bottom line, and I understand all that. But if either side believes the other side is taking advantage of them, then that trust is broken, and that relationship is broken, and that business will be broken in the long term. So, yeah.
It's pretty amazing. I mean, how important those not only personal values, right? Integrity, credibility, doing what we say we would do, things like that, but also the way a company, whether they're looking for an outsourced partner or they are an outsourced provider, is really important. That concept of the culture piece. How do we do business? And are we upfront about what's really going to happen once we sign this dotted line?
Right. Yep.
I mean, holy cow.
On both sides. Yeah.
Yeah, both sides. And so it is different. I guess there's more ambiguity. The more people we have, the more moving parts there are, the more ambiguity there is in terms of making sure the communication has occurred correctly and completely to make this job done. Do you have best practices or ideas that you could share to help somebody who might be struggling with an outsourced partner or feeling like they're being taken advantage of or trying to land a big whale, if you will, not sure that it's because it's on the upper echelon of what they can support, but it would be great to have. What kind of tips would you have for being candid and upfront?
That's a big question. How much time do we have?
I know, right?
I go back to integrity. And I think that on both sides, whether you're the service provider or the customer, that when someone is coming from a position of integrity and candor in terms of what can and can't be done, and kind of can and can't and why, and where they see things going, and not to over-engineer the whole relationship, but kind of making sure that you've got the right communication cadence set up, and again, the measures of success and the measures of failure, if you will, in terms of the SLA, and having all those conversations up front so that, as a service provider, you're broadcasting the message, I want to do a good job for you. I care about integrity. I care about the outcomes that I deliver for you. And as the consumer of those services, you want someone who is going to be cognizant of that responsibility, because you are entrusting part of your business to them. So, you need to have kind of those mechanisms established that measure exactly what needs to be done, and have regular communications. Don't let 90 days go by before you have a check-in in terms of how are things going one way or the other. And if you are a service provider, and if you do get upside down in your relationship because you didn't do something properly, my tendency is to believe that most of your clients would rather have the service delivered properly and profitably to you, and that if the contract is completely upside down, then they're not going to get what they want either. So if you've made a mistake, kind of telling yourself early and often, and don't try to hide it. Certainly don't degrade your service. If you're a provider, don't degrade your service to meet a cost that was below what you need to deliver the quality of service that you've promised, whether you did it purposefully to win the piece of business, or accidentally because you missed something. Kind of all goes back to if you will, the bidding process in terms of making sure you're getting from your customer, if you're a service provider, all the details you need to deliver the service you're promising to deliver. And then conversely, the customer needs to make sure they've done the work internally to know exactly what they're asking of their service provider. Gets back to communication, gets back to details, kind of gets back to all those kinds of things we spoke of earlier in the conversation.
So we've talked about managing expectations, and we've talked a lot about planning, and we've talked a lot about the need to have project management, basically awareness of what's going on during the process. And why is it bold to have those clear expectations?
Why is it bold? It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be a bold new idea. I think the challenge is organizations have kind of their internal momentum and practices with a lot of unspoken processes and a lot of weak links in a service delivery chain are handled kind of outside of the business process. So, instead of using your enterprise platform, data gets exported to spreadsheets and everyone's kind of off in a corner doing the spreadsheet kind of a thing because they can't get the system to do what they want it to do. So I think, outsourcing, it's an interesting thing. It's a good thing in the sense that it causes companies to really consider what they're doing and creates a wonderful opportunity to really evaluate how well they're doing things and kind of how effective their organization is and where there's room for improvement. You kind of go back to business process optimization, that to really use tools and try to, from a business process outsourcing perspective, in terms of using tools to improve the process before you outsource it, as opposed to throwing a whole section of business process over the wall and saying, you guys figure it out, is a recipe for disaster. Unless you're dealing with some of the major consulting companies who are in the process of doing business process optimization. So, it's doing the basic blocking and tackling shouldn't be a bold idea. It requires just a lot of thoughtfulness in terms of understanding how things are done currently before you ship it over to somebody else.
You are the first person who has ever said doesn't have a reason that it's bold, and actually says it should not be bold. And I want to say, I think that's amazing, because in this case, and in a lot of other cases, sometimes fine is okay, right?
Yeah.
No, and relying on processes that iteratively improve over time based off of what's happening macro outside in the great big wide world and within our organization that may be little and it may be large. But to recognize that things don't have to be bold to be right.
True. And part of this, outsourcing was kind of this big sea change, I don't know. Honestly, I can say a couple of decades ago, but outsourcing's always been around, but there was this big sea change of people outsourcing different things because technology was changing so fast and costs were needed to be adjusted and all kinds of different issues. And so the knee-jerk response was, we're going to outsource. We're going to outsource our entire technology organization to somebody else to run for us. Things are, I think, different now in terms of companies now are more schooled in continuous improvement, are more schooled in metrics, and are less likely to evolve into a situation where they feel compelled to try to find a low-cost solution or to try to find somebody to take on this headache, because they're not going to walk themselves into that headache. Outsourcing is now, it's a standard part of business practice. It's the recognition that it has a role to play. I need to get something to market fast. I can't hire the talent in my local marketplace. I don't want to hire on talent to do this. I need, 6 months of 6 people for 6 months to do this. And then I'm kind of back to what I need to do. It's not bold or innovative or new. It's become a standard business practice to turn to resources and recognizing that not all companies are good at all things, and companies need to really focus on the core competencies as opposed to trying to be good at all things, and turn to those who are expert in certain matters to let them take care of those things for them.
As with every relationship, both personal and professional, there is a need for communication. It is a partnership of relationships between people, and that partnership, to be a win-win, to be supportive of both people at both parties involved, starts by managing expectations and that internal review and that constant, where are we? Where are we going? What needs to change? Because as long as our companies are asking questions like that, we are able to effectively communicate with our outsourced partners to ensure we still have the right match between the service that we need or the service we're providing and the people who we're giving it to or partnering with. You can find all the program notes at thevoiceofboldbusiness.com/P106. That is voiceofboldbusiness.com/P for program 106. The Business of Outsourcing can also be searched on the website. You listened to Alex, you heard what we were talking about with outsourcing and the underlying relationships that go with it. Subscribe and rate the program. Tell us, what do you like? What are you working on? What are the things that you've learned through the experience of outsourcing within your organizations and the role that you are in? It's your experience. It's what you bring to the table. It's how you think that will improve not only your efficiency and expertise in what you do, also add value to the company that you are working for and holding a leadership position within. Our role is to get there with our teams and for us to be bold leaders and model for our employees. Remember, take a very close look at the business of outsourcing.
Subscribe at thevoiceofboldbusiness.com and get more information, program notes, and past episodes. Bold leaders approach each situation and focus on action to achieve a higher level of leadership. Jessica Dewell, your business advocate, is the host of the Voice of Bold Business Radio. Thank you for joining us.